Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Safeguarding Resource and Support Hub webinar entitled Whose Risk Is It Anyway? This is the third in a series of webinars hosted by the Safeguarding Resource and Support Hub. And the Hub is really here to support organizations in the international development and aid sector to strengthen their safeguarding policy and practice. So my name is Jean Elphick, and I will be chairing this morning's session in my capacity as a member of the Hub's advisory group. So firstly, if we just go through a little bit of housekeeping, you will surely know that I think any discussion of SEAH or sexual exploitation, abuse or sexual harassment or safeguarding can potentially leave any of us feeling a little bit rattled. And that's especially if it brings up sensitive topics or things that are close to your own experiences. So we really urge you to practice self-care. And if you need to, please reach out for support, either through networks close to you or have a look at the information and support and resources that are available on the RSH website. These discussions are never easy, but we really think that having courageous conversations is very much part of the journey towards making things safer for people in the work that we do. So with that said, I also just want to really thank the panelists today because they will be sharing case studies and some of their own experiences and observations. And these are really not intended to point fingers or name and shame, but rather to give you some really concrete examples to learn from and hopefully internalize and reflect on in your own practice. So you'll notice that your mics are turned off, you're all muted, your videos are off, but that's not because we don't want to see or hear from you. We really hope that you will be able to participate as much as possible. So we've integrated polling questions throughout the webinar. So please, these are totally anonymous, so feel free to participate in the polling questions. There's also a Q&A tab. So if you have questions at any time throughout the webinar, please post your questions, and we have a team behind the scenes that will collate the questions, and hopefully within this hour we will get to pose some of the questions to the panelists. But if your questions aren't handled during the hour, don't panic. We will get to answering all the questions in writing, and those will be shared with everybody who's registered on the webinar in the coming weeks. There is also a link in the chat box, which is a link for closed captioning. So if it would be helpful for you to see subtitles in real time, please click on the link and open it in a separate screen so that you can follow along and have something to help you keep up with the questions. Right, so the final thing is that this session will be recorded, and so once we are completed, it will be shared on the RSH website. So if you want to watch it again or share it with others, you're welcome to do so. So to kick us off, we have a short video that asks a number of questions. So here we go.
As leaders of organizations that work with vulnerable groups like children, we pay so much attention to looking after the money donated to us. We keep money safe. We have checks and balances in place, strict financial controls, and every year, external auditors double-check us to hold us accountable. But do we place the same emphasis on keeping our people safe?
What about keeping children safe?
Do we have strong policy and practice in place to protect beneficiaries and our staff? Are we holding our organizations accountable for providing environments that prevent harm, abuse, and exploitation.
So in our sector, it seems that financial risk and financial risk management is really something that's really widely accepted. A lot of time and effort and resources get put towards it. And it's seen as something that's, unquestionably something that is needed to make us for sustainable organizations and sustainable work. But we really feel that mitigating risks to people receives so much less attention. So there are so many examples out there of how organizations have just failed to anticipate serious risks of SEAH until there's a media-fueled scandal. And we are hoping through bringing this into discourse and talking about identifying and recognizing and mitigating risks before things go wrong and before people are harmed, that we can really start to change the situation. So our panelists today are going to break down risk at 3 different levels. So the first level that we're going to look at is, of course, the people that we are all here to serve, the children and communities that our programs and projects work towards helping. Now, they, as you can see in the diagram, stand at the top of this precarious pyramid, and on the shoulders of the foot soldiers of our work, which are people who staff that work on the ground with people every day. And I think often we think that the only risk, or the sort of immediate risk that we think about, is the risk of staff of organizations harming beneficiaries, or the children and community members where we work. However, I hope that as we go through the different case studies this morning, you'll realize that there's so many more layers and so many more people who could be put at risk. Firstly, of course, there is a risk to children and communities at the hands of staff members. However, we also need to look at other areas of risk. For instance, we often don't critically engage with safeguarding risks that might crop up when children and the communities that we work with often unintentionally, our programs support harmful behaviors or hierarchies or social norms where we are actually working. In addition to this, we need to consider the risks of staff. And I think one of the things that is constantly on our minds is that working in the development or international aid sector, of course, exposes staff members to a huge variety of really difficult and traumatic situations. And this over time takes its toll. But where we also often fail to recognize risk of safety of staff members is amongst each other. We often overlook the much more subtle internal politics and harmful behaviors that can happen within organizations. Unless there are really strong systems in place and good leadership, it can also be really difficult to speak out and notify and talk about and learn about risks that are cropping up within the work that we do. And of course, a lot of this is because we often in our sector base a lot of our work on the assumption that we are here to do good, we are here to help people, and therefore we do no harm. But this really is a huge assumption. At the base of our pyramid, we have the broader sector, and this is what all of our work is founded on. So those who are really powerful actors in the broader sector are often really far away from the people on the ground and children and communities where we are working. And so it makes it a lot more difficult to recognize and understand the types of risks that are cropping up on the ground. The other thing is that often a huge proportion of development work, which happens far away in the global south, for instance, is funded and influenced by governments, NGOs, and donors in the global north. This is a system with inherent structural flaws, but on the other hand, it's a system that is starting to exert a kind of peer pressure and focus our attention through conversations like in this webinar on changes that really support keeping people safe. So our webinar has some key messages which we'd like to share with you today. And by talking you through 3 case studies at each level of those risk levels, at the individual, organizational, and sectoral levels. We really hope to shine a spotlight on the largely blind spot of safeguarding in our sector and bring the attention of you who are listening, and hopefully through you to those who are really in key positions that are able to make structural changes to the sector in order to shift culture towards making things really a lot safer for humans and keeping people as safe as we safeguard our financial income. So we have a really powerful panel to speak to you today from 3 corners of the African continent. So from Uganda, we have Deogratias Yiga. From South Africa, we have Mahwape Letsie and Dominique Dix-Peak. And from Guinea-Bissau, we have Marjorie Mupandare. Okay, so let's kick off with our first speaker this morning. It's Deogratias, or Deo. Deo has a background in social work and social administration. He has an MSc in development management and senior sectoral planning and management. He is a development management consultant with development links, and has worked for years in the child rights and child protection sector, and more recently really focusing on helping organizations to strengthen their safeguarding policy and practice. He has in fact built capacity in more than 50 organizations and is currently leading a team that supports implementing partners of the Oak Foundation in East Africa. So I'm going to hand over to Deo, and that's it from me.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair Jean, for that kind and beautiful introduction. Good morning or good afternoon to all our listeners, depending on where you are joining us from, which part of the world you are. It's a pleasure for me today to join this webinar and talk about the subject of safeguarding. Jean has beautifully introduced the theme of this discussion, which is around the concept of risk and whose risk it is. This concept is central to all our safeguarding work across the 3 target groups that have been well flagged. In my presentation today, the purpose and the scope of my presentation in the next 10 minutes or 9 minutes as they remain will focus on unpacking and introducing this concept of risk and why it is so important for our work in safeguarding, to also highlight why it is important that we do a proper risk analysis to inform our safeguarding measures, and lastly, how we do this safeguarding risk analysis. However, before doing all this, I want to start by sharing a brief experience from my work in the area of safeguarding. So over the last 10 years, I've been working especially for international organizations to support their partners, their development partners in the South, all to support their country offices to strengthen safeguarding work in the field. And I visited and worked with one organization in Africa, an organization that I think was quite serious about issues of safeguarding. So I was sent by their head office to their country office to help deepen the work around safeguarding. They had a great safeguarding policy, but they really believed that the policy was not being implemented effectively. So we organized to have a deeper dive into this safeguarding discourse through a 3-day workshop with all staff, from the support staff to the top management. I also had an engagement with the children. This organization is working with children, young people living and working on the streets, and they provide a facility where they can come in, spend a night, have a safe environment before going back onto the streets. So over the 3 days that we were with this organization, we had deep and valuable discussions around safeguarding. We explored very controversial issues relating to the position of children and young people and how they relate to this whole area of safeguarding. There were a number of controversies around the position of children in society and how they should be treated. We also had perspectives from children, and we explored what safeguarding means in practice for behaviors of staff and all stakeholders associated with this organization within the cultural context in which the organization is working. And after the training, a month after the training, I had a call following up what we had covered and what impact the training had had. And 2 things stood out. One, I was told by the director that after this engagement, they had had a follow-up engagement with the children based on the insights from the training. And that opened their eyes to so many issues around some of their staff. And as a consequence, they had asked one of their key staff, who is the nurse, to resign, and she had left. And this is because of the stories that they had from talking to the children. I had got some insights from the children about these stories. Then they also told me that the security guard who guarded the place where children come and spend the night had voluntarily resigned a week after the training. Because having gone through this discussion for 3 days, he felt that it was unsafe for him to work in an organization where she had to discipline children, but was not going to be allowed to beat these children, to smack them, because otherwise, how was he supposed to control these children? So for his good and the good of organization, he decided, I have to resign, and he had resigned. But this is an organization where they had had a policy for 2 years, and people had signed it, and it was assumed that the policy is working. There is a lot that I learned from this organization, but the few key things that stand out are the following. Next. 1, many of us in our organizations, we think that because we have a good policy, therefore we are doing a great job. We are okay. We have a wonderful policy as an organization, so we are good. 2, many of the organizations, especially in the global South, we are embracing this discourse around safeguarding because we are required to comply by our donors, by our head offices. So it's a matter of compliance and ticking off the box that we have a policy. but we have not unpacked what this means for us. 3, having an organizational safeguarding policy itself is not sufficient if we do not engage the stakeholders within the organization more deeply on the rationale, the values that underpin this policy, and the implications of this policy on their behavior. And lastly, my experience also across many organizations is that many of us actors in the development sector believe that maltreatment, abuse, and exploitation are things that vulnerable people are being exposed to outside there in the community, not because of our organizations or from our organizations. We must tend to externalize this whole issue of risk because we believe we are doing a great job as organizations. We are helping people who are vulnerable. We can't be the wrongdoers. So this is part of my reflection from, working with many organizations in the South. Building on this, I want to move on to the concept of risk, which is central to our safeguarding work. What does it mean? It means exactly what it means in English. It is the possibility that something undesirable will happen unless preemptive action is taken. So in safeguarding, the concept of risks refers to the possibility that a violation in form of abuse, maltreatment, or exploitation against somebody who is less powerful in a given context will actually happen. It has not yet happened, but it will happen. It could happen unless mitigative action is taken. So many times people think that when we talk about safeguarding and talk about risk, we are choosing them of maltreating or abusing people. Sometimes it might be true, but the broad thrust of safeguarding work, be it around the concept of risk, is a recognition that something could go wrong and we need to act to mitigate this before we have a violation. Safeguarding risks are embedded within the domains of unequal power and unquestioning trust. Whenever we think about risk, we also simultaneously must see that underlying this risk is the concept of power that is unequal, where some people are powerful, others are less powerful, and where some people are trusted unquestioningly, that they can't do anything wrong. They will always be doing what is in the best interest of others. Risk analysis and mitigation is the basis for preventive action in our safeguarding work. It's an important concept. Next, why is risk analysis important in safeguarding? First, it builds organizational ownership for safeguarding. I've already highlighted the fact that for many organizations, the concept of risk is seen, of safeguarding is seen as an imposition because it's external. They don't think they pose a risk. So when you go through a systematic process of looking internally at our ways of work, at what we do, you are able to see these risks, and then you are able to own the safeguarding agenda because ownership is premised on a good appreciation that we really have homegrown risks that we pose as an organization to the people around within the organization and outside the organization. So it is important that we understand this risk so as to ensure that we build ownership for the safeguarding agenda. It also facilitates contextualization of safeguarding measures because there's always a risk to assume the risks are the same across all organizations. When we do a systematic risk analysis, we are able to know that risks vary from organization to organization. Some are the same indeed, but some vary from organization to organization, and design measures that speak to the specific context. And lastly, it is the basis for ongoing monitoring of progress over time. Lastly, I want to talk about how do we analyze these risks. One, when we are analyzing the risk, it's a systematic process. We need to look, one, at the organization, its structures, its procedures, and methods of work. What risks are embedded within the method of work of the organization. Secondly, the people. What knowledge do they have? What skills and what attitudes and behaviors do they show? That will also help us to identify certain risks around the people. And lastly, the programs. What we do, how it impacts on social structures, on service delivery environment, and the general risk exposure from our services. And this will also help us to understand the risks around our programs. So all in all, meaningful risk analysis is systematic, deliberate, and should involve all the key stakeholders in the organization, especially the target and the most vulnerable groups. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Deogratias. And this really is a time for us to critically engage with situations where there's unequal power and questioning trust. So our next speakers are from an organization called Africa Tikkun in South Africa. We have Mokgwepe Letsie. She has a master's in development studies and is just kicking off her PhD in development studies at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. She is joined by her colleague Dominique Dix-Peak, who has a background in psychology and education and also monitoring, evaluation and learning. The two of them are going to be talking to us really about risk analysis at the staff level. So I'm going to hand over to Mokgwepe and Dominique.
Thank you very much, Jean. As mentioned, my name is Dominique and I'm joined with Mokgwepe. We work for an organization called Africa Tikkun, and we work with children from roughly 2 years old all the way up until their career ages. Over the past few years, Africa Tikkun has implemented a full child protection research project. We developed and implemented policies, and through this process, we learned a lot. It was very difficult work. It was really interesting and useful work. And because of that work, we've also started working with other organizations around safeguarding and protection. Just to be clear, what we're talking about is keeping both the children and our staff safe. So we're talking about including making sure that there's no harassment in the workplace, and then the abuse and exploitation of children and communities is mitigated. So just to introduce this, we are going to talk about the risks that we've experienced implementing safeguard and protection in the organizations. Mokgwepe is going to give two stories, one indicating the face of safeguarding and the price to pay for whistleblowing, and then we'll discuss key learnings. Next.
Thank you so much, Dom, and thank you, Jean. As Dominic introduced our organization, we work with children, and we have a lot of children that are in and out of our centers, and we work in certain communities. So in 2017, I was responsible for a very extensive participatory process of child protection and child safeguarding in the organization. Like I said, it was very extensive, and it included consulting with children and young people and staff of more than about 1,000. This research revealed a number of gaps in our practice and shocking results and shocking findings in terms of our safeguarding practice. As the face of safeguarding, as someone who was responsible for this process, a number of things also happened to me personally while undertaking this. So, for example, one of the consequences of everything that we did was that our staff had to be vetted. And by vetted, I mean every one of our staff members had to be checked against the Christian register, and that required us submitting our fingerprints and our ID books. As a result of that, we did have a number of staff that resigned or dismissed based on their criminal records, but not necessarily because of the crime they committed, but because of the lack of transparency and honesty of the crimes that they had committed. And of course, we work with children, and transparency and honesty was something that was very important. Because of that, I did encounter or experience a lot of bullying. I received threats to myself and to my family. As you know, that losing a job is not easy. And, you know, I will always give this example when someone was also just like to me, you know, how do you feel about taking my husband's job and basically taking food from my children's mouth? And another example that I can also give was just threats, like I said, to my life of, you know, we will slash your car, or don't feel too comfortable moving around the community. Next, please. The second example, or the second story that I would like to give you, is just the story of whistleblowing or speaking out. This is a story of one of our staff members who was being bullied by their line manager. Despite the, you know, she did the right thing and actually followed a proper and formal grievance process and reported what she was experiencing. The result of that was not a favorable result for her. For example, the bullying and intimidation continued. The manager just dismissed everything as trivial and continued to do so. The consequence for this particular staff member was also very harmful to herself as a person and her health. You know, she had a mental breakdown and was hospitalized for about 21 days. And she also had a mild stroke. And now the question also is, you know, what price do we pay for whistleblowing? And just from the two examples that I gave you, we really learned a lot, and we would like to share those learnings with you. And I'll just like to just hand over to Dominic to tell you those key learnings.
Okay, so firstly, what we found is what we call culture is king. Really, it's important that in an organization, you try to make a transparent environment that can assist people in their organization, and also with making sure that staff are safe in an organization. But this is a long-term process. It takes a long time. It can't just be seen as a once-off. Also, the other thing about it is that you need to remember that you need to take into account two really important aspects: accountability and policy versus practice. If in some organizations, what we found is that there aren't policies, and then people feel completely unable to hold people accountable. But there are other means, like what are your national laws, what are your local laws, those kinds of things. The other thing is what we found is you need to deal with safeguarding concerns immediately. There's such a risk if you don't deal with them immediately. For instance, in the second story that Mokgwape gave, the fact that her concerns weren't dealt with immediately, the person in the story, was that she did end up having mental health concerns and physical concerns because of it. So it's essential that it's dealt with immediately. Lastly, in this point is that Mokgwape did this process for Africa Tikkun as an internal staff member. In some ways, this was even harder because she knew the people that were affected through the safeguarding process. She had to do other work with the people who were affected. She saw them on a daily basis. You know, the threats were from people who she knew, and some of them who were friends and acquaintances. The downside, though, is that so there's a clear downside to doing it internally, but if you do it externally, you may not find that people open up as much. And, you know, safeguarding is quite a sensitive topic, so people may feel safer with someone they know. So there are risks either way. Next. The second point that we want to raise is that around power. Now, as has already been mentioned a couple of times, organizations in the sector often do this work and try to help other people in the communities. But because of that, we don't always recognize the risks in our own organizations. And so we may continue doing harm with our own staff members. Also, people in power in an organization are instrumental in creating the kind of culture in an organization. So they may not recognize the risks. The other thing to consider is that when or if you whistleblow, you often aren't in a position of power. So the consequences to you may be more, at least in the short term, there may be more negative effects. And then holding people accountable is really hard. And then holding people accountable within the same level of seniority can be extremely hard.
Okay. So in conclusion, we actually adopted this code from an anonymous person, but we know the thing about safeguarding is that it is a very difficult process. And like Dominic said, I had a lot of contemplating about, would it have been easier if it was an external person versus an internal person? So we would just like to leave you with the following. Speaking out is hard. Holding it in is hard. Choose your hard. Holding people accountable is hard, and not holding people accountable is also hard. Choose your hard. And just in general, undertaking a safeguarding process is a very difficult long-term process. However, not undertaking it is also very difficult, it's very hard, and also very dangerous. So again, I urge you to choose your hard. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Dominique and Mokgwape. We are now going to move on and zoom right out to look at things at a sectoral level. Our final speaker on this webinar is Marjorie Mupandare. She is busy with her PhD in public health at the University of Hertfordshire. Her background is in public health and international studies, and she has a huge amount of experience in humanitarian assistance and emergency preparedness and response, and has also worked in protection, gender and diversity. She has worked for multiple UN agencies, governments and NGOs all over Africa. So I am now going to hand over to Marjorie.
Thank you so much, Jean, for that introduction. Without further ado, let's proceed to the presentation. I'll be talking about sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment at the institutional or sectoral level. The overview of my presentation, I'll look at sexual exploitation and abuse in the aid and development sector, the risks and challenges, then the sector responses and impact on reducing risk. Next slide, please. Yes, the sector has gone on a journey on safeguarding, and all organizations within the sector have been on a journey as well. The first scandal in the sector was reported in 2002, which exposed levels of sexual exploitation and abuse, primarily of women and girls, which resulted in the Prevention of Sexual Exploitation and Abuse Bulletin. Then in 2008, it was recognized that there remained a problem, particularly with reporting. Save the Children report on which is entitled No One to Turn To, from May 2008, was published and shared, and it was a sampling of beneficiaries in 3 countries, Cote d'Ivoire, South Sudan, and Haiti. And 2/3 of the persons surveyed recalled incidents of sexual exploitation and abuse. Then there was also the Humanitarian Accountability Partnership Report, entitled To Complain or Not to Complain, from June 2008, which also had similar reports or results to the SAVE report. Then in 2018, there was a scandal that involved the Save the Children, which shone light on different types of abuse, that of staff, and led to an expansion of the scope of sexual exploitation and abuse to include sexual harassment in the workplace. Then of late, in a couple of months ago, a few weeks ago, we had a report or reports that came out of sexual exploitation in DRC with regards to the Ebola outbreak, where a number of staff from humanitarian agencies were reported to have abused women in those communities. Next slide, please. However, the sector has been able to put up a number of policies or actions in place to respond to these scandals to date. Well, there are commitments that are made across the sector, which include the zero tolerance, applying standards, commitment to diverse professional backgrounds. But however, the key fundamental question is, have these worked? The latest situation in the DRC suggests not, so we need a new approach. Let's go to the next slide. There are a number, the next slide, please. There are a number of sector challenges for sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment that are there. The previous speakers have talked about sexual exploitation and abuse as almost linked to power and differential power relationships. The humanitarian personnel are always in a position of power or trust compared to those they will be assisting. As such, this position creates a potential for abuse. And you also realized that in most of these organizations, they are male dominated in terms of the leadership. And this is further compounded by the weak governance structures that are in most humanitarian agencies. There's also an issue of, like I said, power, yes, and then there's also an interface with patriarchy and privilege that actually is prevalent in the aid sector. There's also another challenge of having most organizations have minimal or even no individuals that are selected to deal with issues of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. There's also another challenge of having few women in senior leadership positions in the humanitarian sector that also makes women in that sector even vulnerable to sexual exploitation and abuse and even harassment. There's also another issue of the reactiveness of the system. Like I said, there are a number of reports that have been produced, and it appears in the humanitarian sector, we tend only to react when these reports come out and then there is a lot of attention and the need to change. I think there's a need for the sector to move from that system of being reactive. There's also another question that comes into play. Who really do these women come to with their complaints of sexual exploitation and abuse, and when? There's also an issue as well of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment amongst humanitarian workers that is compounded by the different types of contracts that the humanitarian sector has. If you go to the next slide, let's go to the next slide. The next slide also looks at the issues of the representation of women by nationality. Women remain underrepresented in the UN system and even in the entire development sector itself. This underrepresentation is greater at senior levels. It is also impacted by the intersection with nationality, where the lowest rates of representation are in West and Central Africa and the Arab states. The main question as well is, yes, we see that there is a 25%, 35%, 40% in the various countries in the developing world, but what kind of positions do they really hold? If the UN Women has published in 2016 a report as well that showed that less than 45% of women hold senior positions in the UN sector, in the UN system itself, as well as in the UN Secretariat. So these are fundamental questions that I believe the UN or the humanitarian sector needs to be able to address. The next slide, please. What are the implications for the sector because of this? We are still in the sector that is beset by media coverage of reasonable large-scale abuses taking place. The coverage of the situation in the DRC only serves to give rise to questions on why this is still taking place despite the sector response and commitments, and whether there's an endemic problem in the sector that the sector cannot address. This is a risk for the sector as well as organizations working within it. But it also presents an opportunity to really examine what can be done differently in the future to tackle sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment in the sector. Increasing diversity and tackling power, privilege, and patriarchy will reduce the risk the sector continues to face. So the report that is currently in the media stream at the moment of women being abused in DRC really poses serious challenges and really shows that there's a need for continued address by actors in the humanitarian sector to address issues of sexual exploitation and abuse. It raises also questions whether the zero tolerance approach really works. Is it really working? It highlights challenges and constraints with accountability within the sector. And it also shows that the risks remain regardless of the efforts that are being done by different organizations to strengthen practices and to ensure that we do not do harm to the communities that we serve. The next slide, please. So thank you so much for having listened to my presentation, and I hope this presentation will be able to help in improving the efforts that are being done on addressing or combating sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment in different institutions and different sectors, particularly in the development sector. I thank you so much.
Thank you so much to our panelists for their input. And what we are going to do now is to cross over to answering some questions and posing some questions to our panel. So our first question is really about the sort of nitty-gritty and practical advice on really engaging with the children and communities where we work and getting their input and advice and learning from them about the types of risks that face them. So it's really important to engage with them, but how do we effectively and ethically engage with children around such sensitive issues and identifying risk? So I'm going to pose this question to two of the panelists. One panelist, Deo, if you could answer this question as an external consultant who has, limited time in an organization to build up trust with children, and also with the sort of limited time afterwards to actually ensure that policy and practice in turn keep children safe. And then I'm also going to ask Mokgwape, as an internal person, how did you go about engaging with children internally within an organization to learn more about safeguarding risks for facing them? So Deo, maybe let's start off with you and just some of the sort of methods and how you actually go about it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. This is a very interesting and central question, because within this framework where people believe, that we just need a policy at all costs, everything is done hush-hush, there is no process. But it's extremely important that if we are going to have a meaningful safeguarding framework, we need to analyze risks with the people who are at risk because they understand these risks better. So that is right, spot on. There are methodologies for working with the children, because that is also key, that you need to create a good environment for children to understand what you're trying to do and also to open up. So the environment, the methods, there are proper methods for different categories of, stakeholders that are appropriate. You can't use the same methods for adults as well as for children. We don't have the time to go through the details of this, but there are resources on how you can properly and professionally engage with the children in a safe way. Now, as an outsider, in this case, when I was going back to my story, of course, that's a very important challenge. How do you get the trust of vulnerable people, especially children? So in this case, I used somebody who is local, who is from the local community, but not part of the organization. So I had a colleague, and I asked for permission to be part of listening in, because I didn't even understand the language that the children were speaking. So I used a local person, but we didn't also have enough time to go into the nitty-gritty. So that's why I asked the team, I just got pointers that there are risks here that they are not aware of, and asked the staff team, the management team, to take time and engage with the student more deeply, because I think they have more trust and more time to engage with the children. So as an external person, you are very limited. You have to build the capacity to identify the right people within the organization that children trust to engage them. Thank you.
Okay. All right, thank you so much, Jean. What we did, just like Deo mentioned, trust really is very important, and I was internal, so there was a level of trust because I was someone who they would see on a regular basis, and they had seen my face and they knew I was there. And I was also local. So for example, I did almost all of the participatory exercises with children using a local language and not English. Which also just became a challenge because then I had to translate most of the work. So trust as well. And also just using, just being flexible in the methodologies that you use and allowing the children to lead us. So sometimes we use drawing, sometimes we use songs, and just checking, is this particular person more visual or would like to talk and so forth. But I think I would really love to emphasize on the trust aspect of it, that I had to build a relationship with them. And just to say that this took over a year of me going back and forth and collecting this kind of material.
Thanks so much. The next question is that organizations are really being asked or urged to stop really trying to use all of these different tactics to figure out if there are safeguarding risks, and just to assume that SEAH is happening and that systems are supporting that. So if we don't try and find out, don't we risk losing a nuanced understanding of really a contextual understanding of what the drivers of SEAH are, and appropriately adapting our policy and practice to account for that? So I think perhaps Marjorie or Dominique, either of you, if you have anything to share on this.
Oh, thank you so much for that question, June. I think yes, addressing issues of SEAH are really it is really important. It is always good or advisable for organizations to continue carrying out studies involving local players, particularly that are on the ground, that understand the various cultures of the people that are in the ground, to be able to help in identify different types of SEAH, and then help these organizations in formulating policies that fit the context. So issues of SEA that might be happening in West Africa might be different from those that might be happening in Southern Africa or in Asia. So there's always a need for organizations to be able to understand in depth the different types of SEA that present or that are defined in a particular context, and ensure that they have policies to address these issues, so that we do not continue to do harm to the different communities we serve, and we also don't fall in the risk of having our reputation continuously being tarnished, and yet we are in communities to serve people. The relationship that we should have with the partners or the communities that we serve should be based on trust. We should be people who are viewed with trust, and communities that are in need that we serve should actually be seeing us as people that are trustworthy. So there is a need for continuously investing in continuous studies on the different types of SEAH and continuously reformulating our policies so that they continue to fit the context. Thank you.
Marjorie, just following on from that, there's a question about how to handle things when what is legal or illegal in one context is different from kind of international standards of human rights and children's rights. Maybe could you just speak to how do you reconcile it when things in context on the ground may be well accepted practices, whereas in other contexts and at a sort of universal level, with respect to human rights, it's not okay. How do you reconcile these disconnects?
That's a very good question. Actually, as practitioners in the development sector, one key attribute rather that we should have is of being able to understand issues of diversity and be flexible to the various cultures that we interface with. Most agencies in the humanitarian sector have got mandatory trainings that they are pushing, or that they insist that all their staff conduct, such as on zero tolerance and others that are done even repeatedly within a year, twice in a year, so that people are able to understand and appreciate the different cultures. One needs to be flexible always when you're working in the humanitarian sector. Your culture from wherever you are coming in definitely is different, or might be different from the culture or context that you are going to be working in. So one needs to be conversant of that. You actually need, as a humanitarian actor, before you go into a certain culture, it is advisable that you try to read all the different guidance that are there to understand the culture in which you are going to be working in, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, the different types of dressing, the kind of dress that they accept and what they do not accept. So one always needs to be able to understand this. And as a humanitarian worker, if you have got the humanitarian work in your heart, you actually need to be flexible and understand that, because at the end of the day, your work is to help in serving lives and communities that are in need. So one needs to be flexible and understand that. So most humanitarian actors, you go into certain contexts where you're told, okay, this dressing is not allowed, you have to dress in that way. And you realize, okay, yes, let me do that, because at the end of the day, it helps me in achieving my objective. It helps me in serving the lives that I need. It also helps me in serving the reputation of my organization and serving the lives of even other humanitarian workers that are with you there, and even some that might come even after yourself. So it is always important for one to be flexible and understand and respect these different kinds of cultures that are in communities. Thank you.
Deo, did you have something to add there?
Yeah, I think especially the question was, I think somebody raised the issue of child marriage. There are these concerns that are embedded in local culture and beliefs and practices, which are not in sync with the global standards. So in some countries, there's alignment between the cultural and legal context and the international standards. Where there is a discordancy between the two, I think as actors, we need to be guided by the universal standards. However, we need to enter into dialogue with our stakeholders about the values that underpin these standards. And also realize that even if it may not be able to pursue violations in the court of law because the legal framework doesn't allow it, within our organizations, we can have these standards and we can engage with the staff to understand why, for instance, it would not be acceptable for us to condone child marriage, even if the law doesn't prohibit it. It requires a lot of dialogue and cultural engagement with the stakeholders.
Brilliant. Well, everybody, that has already brought us to the end of our hour together. I want to give a huge thank you to everybody who's tuned in to have a listen. And I really hope that you've benefited from some of the discussion today. The there's still a bunch of fantastic questions that have cropped up. So we will respond to those in writing. I am going to close off for today, thanking you again for your participation. There will be a couple of questions that are asking you for some feedback. In addition, if you have not done so already, please subscribe to the newsletter on the Safeguarding Support and Resource and Support Hub. And the current newsletter is available on the website. This webinar will also be posted on the website soon. And keep an eye out for future webinars and future discussions, and for the further discussion on the questions that you've posed today. Thank you very, very much. Thank you, panelists.